Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I am Vignesh Karthik, a PhD student at King's India Institute, King's College, London. And here we are with another event of the Confronting Caste series. So, Confronting Caste is a series of conversations hosted by the King's India Institute at King's College, London, to bring analytical attention to the question of how caste operates in contemporary India society. This means not only studying caste-based discrimination and oppression across transnational contexts, but also investigating how this relates to other structures and systems. Dr. Srilata Sarkar is the convener, and I am the coordinator of the series. Today, we will be talking on the topic politics, dignity, and empowerment. The speakers we have today, Dr. Indrajit Roy from the University of York, and Dr. Karthik Rao Manoharan, who set to join the National Law School in Bangalore, will be taking a closer look at the aspects of anti-caste politics in contemporary times, dwelling on ways in which they intersect and fault lines they expose within the Indian political system, electoral and otherwise. It will engage with the philosophical, practical, and ethical dimensions of understanding caste in forging social movements, politicking, and policy making. And to chair the event today, we have our very own Dr. Anastasia Piliavsky. Dr. Anastasia Piliavsky is a social anthropologist who works on India's democracy and the role of vernacular values, especially the hierarchical in India's social and political life. She's the author of Nobody's People, Hierarchy as Hope in the Society of Thieves, published by Stanford in 2020, and editor of Patronage as Politics in South Asia and principal investigator of a European Council funded project on India's politics in its vernaculars. Today, our speakers will be talking on the questions through their presentations on politics of Periyar E.V. Ramasamy as an iconoclast and social reformer in Tamil Nadu, and Lalu Prasad Yadav as a politician who emerged from the anti-caste discourse in Bihar. Anastasia, over to you.
Hi. So I would just like to get the conversation going and get Indrajit and Karthik to start telling us what it is that they think. I mean, it's an extraordinarily interesting question. Whether it is and the extent to which it is that caste as such, caste as a system, does get challenged in India, and what are the ways of challenging it? Because of course, sort of traditional sociological wisdom tells us that caste is sort of the water that India swims in, right? Caste is the logic of social life. For better or for worse, that is how society is organized. That is the main framework for the organization of social units, right? But we do know, of course, both of our speakers have worked extensively on movements that do question caste, not just castes, and their presence and viability and the logic of their dominance and so on, but rather the system as such. So really over to you. I won't repeat what Vignesh said by way of introduction of Indrajit and Karthik, but I will just mention that Indrajit is teaches politics at the University of York, and Karthik has just published a book about Periyar Ramaswamy, who is an anti-caste political philosopher, about whom I would love to hear about more.
Do you want me to start, Anastasia? Is that
Sure.
all right? And I'll just sort of briefly introduce the politics of Lalu Prasad Yadav, and perhaps reflect a bit on the question you asked. If I could sort of speak for about 15-20 minutes, is that all right? And then I'll hand over back to you, Anastasia, so you can maybe invite Karthik or have some questions, whatever. I mean,
that's right.
Boss, so.
Why don't you speak for as long as you'd like, really, 15-20 minutes. Then we'll pass it over to Karthik, and I would like to open this to conversation with those who are present so that it's a livelier sort of event.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Karthik. Thank you, Vignesh, and to the team at King's. So I'll get straight to the topic of Lalu Prasad Yadav, who's much more known as a politician, a man of the ground, described as the kingmaker of Indian politics through the 1990s. And we'll sort of maybe open up to reflections on what we might learn from his political practice and political ideas. So on March 10th, 1990, Lalu Prasad Yadav, who then was the chief of the Janata Dal in Bihar, assumed the office of the chief minister of the state. Yadav's rise to power arguably inaugurated a new political vocabulary. In his election speeches just before, he had repeatedly said that he stood for dignity, not development. Hame vikas chahiye, samman nahi was the specific slogan. Now, this slogan, of course, didn't operate in a vacuum. Alongside these sloganeering, there were also quite bitter sorts of contests where he targeted the politicians of the Congress party, which then ruled Bihar. In one of his speeches, he said, and I quote, "Our fight is against the wearers of the sacred thread. For centuries, the priests have made fortunes looting peasants. Now I tell them they should learn to milk cattle and graze them, otherwise they will starve." In other speeches, Yadav thundered about the BJP politicians. Of course, remember, this was the BJP of 1989, not the overarching juggernaut that you see now, but still rising on the back of Hindu nationalism. Again, I quote, "Ram should punish these murderous fundamentalists, if he exists, that is. But he is nowhere. If he was there, so many people would not have died." The Bhagalpur riots had just happened in Bihar a few months before. "There would not have been such poverty, such fights," unquote. Now, I found echoes of dignity, the language of dignity, throughout my doctoral fieldwork and subsequent ethnographic work, often couched along these conflictual lines that I've just mentioned. People were constantly talking about and referring often to ijjat, the very commonly used term for dignity. Accounts of laborers not giving ijjat to farmers, of people stigmatized as low castes, demanding to be treated with ijjat by self-styled high castes, of people wanting to lead lives of ijjat, of dignity, was strewn across my field notes. And ijjat is, of course, is a notoriously slippery term, as I'm sure we all know. It could mean honor, which is the preserve of a few. It could also mean dignity, where everyone has some sort of an equal moral worth, something that everyone has innately on account of being human. It belongs to all when it's thought of as dignity, but is recognized only by a few. So it's inherently contradictory, very, very slippery as a term. And as I have researched the ways in which ideas of development are used to maintain and challenge order at local, national, and global scales, I have been compelled to reflect on this narrative of ijjat, dignity, and the broader anti-caste politics that have popularized it across Bihar. I think this is also very relevant at a time when liberal ideas associated with democracy appear to be on the throes of collapse. Now, Yadav's early years in the early 1990s were indeed promising. His government eliminated tree and toddy tax, a move that benefited members of communities who depended on such activities for their livelihoods. Slums in Patna were regularized, and milk suppliers were allowed to freely establish cowsheds in towns and cities. This, of course, doesn't seem like the model of good governance, but this is something that made him extremely popular with folks who were engaged in livestock rearing in cities. Speed breakers in the capital city were removed to allow cyclists to ride comfortably. Perhaps more substantively, about 50% of the seats were reserved for the other backward classes, the members of communities stigmatized as low caste, but who are not quite untouchable in the complicated and graded caste hierarchy with which I'm sure this audience is familiar. So seats were reserved for other backward classes in university-level decision-making bodies, and Bihar University was renamed as B.R. Ambedkar University after India's foremost champion of civil rights. State holidays were declared to mark the birth anniversaries of Ravidas, a 16th century saint who was a fervent champion of social equality in his lifetime. Yadav also extended official support to fairs and carnivals commemorating the Dalit hero Chuharmal, credited with battling caste oppression. As chief minister, Yadav made frequent and unannounced visits to impoverished rural hamlets where members of the state's so-called untouchable communities, Dalits, were forced to live. During these visits, the chief minister himself emphasized the importance of education as a tool that could help the oppressed combat oppression and challenge the hierarchies imposed on them. To that end, he is credited for shifting schools in villages from localities populated by the so-called high castes to locations where they would be more easily accessible from the hamlets of the group stigmatized as low caste and untouchable. However, a large proportion of rural children were often unable to attend schools. Their household occupations as marginal and small peasants meant their labor was called upon when grazing cattle and tending to livestock. Recognizing these practical difficulties, his Janata Dal government inaugurated what are called Charvaha Vidyalayas, literally schools for shepherds, in 1994. These open-air schools were established on government-owned pasture land where pupils could attend class while keeping an eye on livestock as they grazed. Furthermore, students were provided with a daily cash stipend. This is long before universal scholarships were being talked about by the United Nations. School uniforms and books, as well as a free midday meal. Although the innovative scheme died a sudden death due to poor implementation, the girls and boys who were able to attend these schools for the few years that they operated found that experience life-changing because they had never before been anywhere near the vicinity of a school. And a contemporary journalist noted the excitement and buzz around these Charvaha Vidyalayas. Under Yadav's tenure as chief minister, the backward castes and Dalit agricultural laborers became emboldened in their claims for fair wages, as well as, perhaps more importantly for them, respect from their dominant caste landlords. They were less inclined to, quietly comply with their own exploitation and discrimination. Further, they were more willing and able to retaliate against the mistreatment of their people and property by the dominant castes. The result, of course, was the intensification of Bihar's infamous caste wars. What was novel after Yadav's rise, however, was the retaliation by the so-called low castes and sometimes even Dalits against the militias of the high castes. For example, in December 1991, members of a high caste outfit that went by the name Savarna Liberation Front gang raped and murdered 10 Dalit women. In February 1992, within 3 months, left-wing militants, all either Dalit or low caste, massacred 35 high caste landlords in retribution. Of course, this is in no way justifying the cycle of violence, but what is important to bear in mind is that violence was now perpetrated by all sides instead of just being the preserve of one. Chronicling his travels in rural Bihar at the turn of the millennium, William Dalrymple narrates this complaint by a high caste landowner who survived that retributive massacre. And I quote, this is from Dalrymple's book, The Age of Kali, I think it's called. Lalu is always encouraging these low castes to rise up against us. Now the Harijans refuse to work for us. The government will not protect us. It is on their side. The lower castes are rising up. This is the Kali Yuga, the epoch of disintegration. Everything is falling apart. And of course, this metaphor of Kali Yuga is telling because it refers to disruption of an entire social order, which is of course what Lalu was very proud to be associated with. As far as Bihar's landowning high caste could see, the advent of Lalu Yadav was nothing short of a disaster. Pritam Singh, a Rajput landlord who I interviewed during my fieldwork back in 2010 and who continues to own vast properties in the adjacent to the area where I did fieldwork, was very nostalgic about the pre-1990 era before Lalu Yadav's ascendance to power. And he told me, now those were the days. The state enjoyed stability. There was prosperity. Everyone lived in harmony. Remember, the 1980s were not terribly great for Bihar in terms of either development or law and order, but nonetheless, Pritam Singh goes on. No one needed to leave their homes because there was plenty of work and plenty of people to do it. Because of course, everyone knew their place, he tells me, wagging his finger. No one spoke out of turn. And then he sighed, but good things rarely last long. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Ghanghor ghataएं, he told me in very poetic language. And we were engulfed before we knew it. An era was passing and we were helpless. Where Pritam Singh attributed these changes to what he called dark clouds, other landlords I met were much more explicit. One of them was vitriolic, in fact. And he told me, Bihar was a wonderful place till that, and he uses the term Lalua as a play on the chief minister's first name. Lalua became chief minister. He and his backwards destroyed the state. They talked about empowering the Harijans, Dalits. They have all ruined the state. To top it all, they say they will protect the Pakistanis, an epithet to describe the Muslims. After Lalua came to power, my interlocutor continued, Bihar's downfall began. These people, and he points his index finger to the ground, indicating he was talking about people lower than him, of lower status than himself, thought they could do whatever they wanted to. Speak out of turn, look us in the eye, keep sitting on their charpais while we walked by, go wherever they want, whenever they want. It is that Lalua who was encouraging these people. Now, these perspectives by the self-styled high caste were, of course, mirrored by subaltern populations. Long after Lalu Yadav was found guilty of corruption and routed in elections in 2005, a common refrain among subaltern people in rural Bihar remained, Lalu Yadav gave us voice. He gave us dignity. And in some ways, long before the United Nations sort of championed the Millennium Development Goals, which of course keep the idea of dignity as central, dignity was in fact being claimed, asserted, practiced, and contested by the poor peasants in rural Bihar. The sociologist Surinder Jodhka once told me after his interviews with Dalit men and women just before the 2014 elections, and this is long after Lalu has gone out of power, there's no question of Dalits supporting the Janata Dal anymore. They in fact hate the Janata Dal and its politics by 2014, but they still tell him, we have Nitish, a reference to Chief Minister Nitish Kumar, on our lips, Modi in our heads, but only Lalu in our hearts. And when Jodhka asks them why, pat comes the reply, he gave us ijjat, he gave us dignity. Now, the narrative of dignity that was popularized by Lalu Yadav frontally challenged a social order that was underpinned by hierarchies of Varna, caste, and Jati. Without explicitly calling for an annihilation of caste, and I think this is important and might speak to some of the points you raised in your introductory remarks, Anastasia, without explicitly calling for an annihilation of caste, such a narrative insists on recognizing the equal moral worth of members of all caste groups. You must count the uncounted, for instance, and this, of course, translates very categorically into the policy imperative of undertaking a caste census, which is a key demand of Lalu Yadav and his political party. Purity and pollution, that were key concepts in the operation of caste, were to be challenged and undermined, as ijjat was interpreted in universal rather than particular terms. So it's not only about some people's ijjat gaining priority over others. Everyone has ijjat. They all are members of different castes, yes, but everyone has equal moral worth. This equal moral worth translates into equal cultural value, for instance, as you can see from the celebration of festivals that are no longer only festivals of specific caste groups, but festivals associated with all other castes are celebrated. So commemorating icons for their association with historically oppressed castes, celebrating festivals that were typically associated with the so-called low castes or Dalits was very much part of this attribution of equal cultural value to everyone. And of course, part of the equal moral worth was also thinking about jobs and positions. So it wasn't just operating in the realm of culture and spirituality, but it was much more concrete and much more to do with real material aspects such as jobs, and which is where the demands for affirmative actions for castes that are listed as other backward class comes in. And this entails, of course, these thinking about equal moral worth of different caste groups entails an appreciation of the reality of caste. A recognition of this equal moral worth may well lead eventually to breaking down of taboos on inter-caste marriages, paving the way for caste to become a meaningless category in the future. But till that was achieved, it was important nevertheless that members of all castes be treated with dignity. Such a view departs, as you can imagine, from a liberal perspective that privileges individual rights over group rights and assumes that individuals are able to assert their rights autonomous of their caste, group, and communal affiliations. Lalu was no liberal, and he was very clear that he was no liberal. It also departs from a Gandhian view that suggests that all occupations are spiritually equal. Remember, Lalu is a committed socialist, mentored by the likes of Ram Manohar Lohia. Recognizing the reality of caste does not entail endorsing the hierarchy of occupations that are implicit in its vision of the social order. And so Lalu is no Gandhian either, although of course they all have to sort of, do the mandatory, reference and reverence of Gandhi during the national holidays, but he's no Gandhian in that sense either. And finally, unsurprisingly, an insistence on recognizing caste as a fundamental unit of oppression in India puts his view at odds with a Hindutva perspective, as you can imagine, that seeks to erase the many inequalities that persist across castes. Lalu is not saying that by recognizing equal moral worth of all castes, we are pretending that all castes are materially equal. That's never the case. Indeed, few politicians have been as abused, as scorned, as hated by the high castes as Lalu Prasad Yadav. And I think this itself will tell you who the high castes identify as enemies and who they don't. His spectacular arrest of Advani's Ratha Yatra in October 1990, of course, you could say is one reason. He dared to stand up to Advani and that chariot procession. He explicitly supported fellow socialist Mulayam Singh Yadav, ordering policemen to fire into a gathering of Karsevaks who were intent on destroying the Babri Masjid later that year. It was an illegal gathering and the chief minister had expressly called for a curfew. That curfew had been flouted. The chief minister ordered firing. Lalu Yadav said that was a good thing. It was tragic that the firing resulted in the deaths of 40 Karsevaks, but it was in the name of maintaining law and order. No less important than these sorts of ways in which Yadav stood up to the Hindutva forces in the 1990s is the manner in which he popularized the vocabulary of Ijjat among the populations oppressed as primitive, untouchable, and low caste. And that, you could say, has remained a thorn in the flesh of the self-styled high castes, who are, as we know, the most vocal votaries of Hindutva. So I'd just like to conclude on three things which might sort of touch on the points that you made in your introductory remark. In terms of challenging caste or challenging the structures of caste, I think, thinking about Yadav and his politics, very clearly you're thinking about ways in which you might challenge caste and subvert the order from within Hinduism. You reappropriate Hindu ideas, Hindu traditions, Hindu practices, from within rather than from without. You think about an alliance of castes, and Lalu was quite clear that caste was a material category. It existed. There was no point, wishing it away. You think about an alliance of castes at the middle and the bottom that challenges the dominance of those at the top. So I think this middle-bottom alliance is it's quite central to Yadav's patterns of mobilization. Conflict is central. There's no point hiding from it. It need not be violent conflict, but a language of us versus them is something that you have to recognize, and that exists. What is important is how you appropriate that language of us versus them, who you build alliances with. And Yadav, as we know, was quite keen to build alliances beyond Hinduism, beyond the Hindu castes, with, as is well known, with Muslims in Bihar, to think about ways in which you might reimagine the social order. He was no revolutionary. There's no question of tearing up the social order and throwing it away, and that would lead to chaos and anarchy. But he was much more in thinking, and the politics gets us to think about how social order might be revised. So he was revisionist in that sense, if you will, if you want to label him something. I'll close on that note, but thank you for letting me speak, and I hand back to you, Anastasia.
Thank you, Indrajit. So I think while we're still fresh on your track, I'll make a couple of remarks, and perhaps you can hold off until Karthik is finished speaking to reply to that, so that perhaps as people listen to Karthik, they can also think about the point I'd like to make. So this business of izzat or ijat, as it's often pronounced sort of in the vernaculars, in the places that you're talking about, is a very important one. The way that the term is used, whatever its sort of semantic shades, is always in what I would call the transitive, meaning it's something that you get from others, it's something that's given, right? And that, therefore, it's something that you earn, right? That's why sort of respect, perhaps even more than honor. Honor is a sort of, in the English language, honor works as a sort of label. It's a brand, honorable minister and so on, etc. But respect is something that is clearly part of social interaction, right? You get respect, right? And in the same way, in Hindi, in Hindustani, you get ijat. Dignity is a very different thing, really. So that translation to say that ijat, and you were giving a lot of very interesting examples of the uses of ijat, and I didn't hear in any of them that they actually would gloss well as dignity, because again, dignity in the English language is not transitive. It's something you have. No one gives it to you. It's something that you, in the logic of human rights, equality, post-Christian equality, and so on. It is, as you say, it's a marker of fundamental, intrinsic human equal worth, right? Although, of course, we have to remember that Jeremy Waldron has this wonderful study of the way that the language, the very key terms of egalitarianism today have come to be. And of course, dignity until quite recently, until as recent as the middle of the 20th century, dignity referred to the dignity of rank. So it's a fundamentally hierarchical term, which was upscaled and transvalued into the language of egalitarianism that has really taken off since the 1970s as the kind of universal moral logic of preserving human life and well-being, right? So Lalu is a very surprising choice to have gotten as someone who is an anti-casteist, because Lalu's politics, and in fact the Yadav politics, have been as reliant on caste assertion as any. It's a triumph of the logic of caste. Caste has been sort of expanded and to incorporate more people to work within, the majoritarian politics of democracy, and all the assertions of why it is that the Yadav should have dignity very much refer to the occupational specificity of the Charwaha, let's say, Yadav caste, and hence all the, public milking of cows and so on. And in the quotes that you were offering, there was a lot of anti-Brahmin, anti-elitist, rhetoric, but none of it, I didn't hear in anything that you quoted, and maybe you just didn't quote something that really is there. I didn't hear anything about equality as such. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that I think it's really important for us to really listen to what the people themselves are saying before we decide that they actually are arguing through the logic and for the logic of equality. So to me, what you were saying, and my sort of long observations and interest in Lalu Yadav, who's a real favorite figure of mine, a figure of great interest, it doesn't suggest at all that there's anything about equality. There's assertion of voice, having a voice, being heard, being listened to, being respected, being given the dignity of rank, which is asserted through very caste-specific markers. being herders, being people who are, Krishna's milk herds and so on, sanctity and so on. But it's all very caste specific. There's nothing that in it that I hear that actually argues against the logic of caste as such, against, abuse of Brahmins, etc. Yes, but not. So let's leave it at that. And I'm sure you'll have a lot to say in response. And let's now pass the microphone on to Kartik and take this up afterwards.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anastasia. And just want to say that I'm really happy to be here in this panel, speaking alongside with Indrajit. Thank you also, Vignesh, for coordinating this event and inviting me. So on that note, just want to start off where Indrajit had ended. He made this remark that Lalu Prasad Yadav was one of the most hated politicians of his times, especially by the elites. Now, I come from a state where there's another politician who merits a similar comment, who is M. Karunanidhi. And it would have been very nice if we had a comparative presentation of Lalu Prasad Yadav and Karunanidhi, because both of them had a lot of mutual admiration for each other and had a lot to give and take in their politics and in their political interactions. But however, I would rather focus in my presentation on a social figure who is equally, if not more, hated for his views on caste, religion, nation, gender, family, and whatnot. Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy. Now, Anastasia introduced me as the author of a book on Periyar. The book is titled Periyar, A Study in Political Atheism. It was published by Orient Black Swan very recently. Now, one of the very key ideas of this book was to place Periyar and Periyarism in sort of a libertarian anarchist tradition, or to provide a libertarian anarchist reading of Periyar, because I felt that's where his thoughts seem to fit in more better. There are many people who say that it's really hard to box Periyar or put him in a category, because given his long public and political career, so it starts somewhere in 1919 and it continues till 1973, right? And he also has been writing very formally since 1925, where he started his party press, the Kudiyarasu, and he never stopped writing or getting his speeches published till his very last speech in 1973, just about 5 or 6 days before his death. So with this sort of a thinker who has had such a prolific output of writings and speeches, but not a coherent monograph or book which would, provide a system or a coherent or a cohesive way of his approach to a particular subject. I think much depends on posthumous interpretation, right? And also a collation of primary sources which have been dispersed over a long period of time, and very frankly bringing them together and trying to find out an essence of Periyar or Periyarism has been quite challenging, right? The first obvious challenge is that all of these works are in Tamil and very few have been published in English. So a familiarity with the language and also the manner in which Periyar speaks is important, right? Bernard Bate has this very important work on, the Dravidian aesthetic and, especially of political oratory, where he notes that Periyar is quite different from the other speakers in Tamil, mainly because of his very simple, colloquial, and if one may say, plebeian use of language, but which also means that we must be familiar with the nuances which the colloquial brings about with it. So that's definitely one challenge which I've faced. And the other, of course, is the manner of Periyar's speeches and writings itself. Now, unlike, let's say, another great anti-caste thinker like Dr. Ambedkar, or theorists like Ram Manohar Lohia, Periyar would not begin on one subject and continue it till the end of his article or his speech. He'll start on something and then he'll end in something else. So, for instance, he'll start on gender equality, he'll move on to religious superstition, then he'll talk about the advance of science and technology and why we still have a backward outlook. Then he'll have a few comments on Rama and Ramayana, and then he'll conclude with the state of politics in Tamil Nadu or India or wherever. So to bring coherence into this sort of a thinking means that you need to have some sort of a considerable familiarity with a wide range of his primary texts to find out what his key interests and the key essence of his thoughts are. So those are some of the few challenges which I face, but when researching Periyar. But today in particular, I want to very briefly talk about one question which Periyar is often associated with, and which I would say to some extent would apply to Lalu Prasad as well, and his predecessor like Ram Manohar Lohia as well, is the Sudra question, right? Because generally all of these thinkers are categorized by academics or commentators like Kancha Ilaya as Shudra thinkers. Now, this term, was in a sense popularized in Tamil Nadu to a great extent by Periyar, the term called Shudra. But as far as the academia, the broader academia is concerned, though you had earlier works by scholars like R.S. Sharma, who wrote Shudras in Ancient India and others, for it to gain considerable popularity, you needed the arrival of someone like Kancha Ilaya. So when he published his book, Why I'm Not a Hindu, he subtitled it A Shudra Critique of Hindutva Philosophy, Culture and Political Economy. For political purposes, Kancha Ilaya prefers the term Dalit Bahujan, building on the concept introduced by Kanshiram, the founder of the Bahujan Samaj Party. And Kancha Ilaya defines Dalit Bahujan as people and castes who form the exploited and suppressed majority. The Shudra concept is used by Kancha Ilaya as a critique of Brahminical ideas so as to arrive at a Dalit Bahujan politics. But all the same, Kancha Ilaya also at certain places tends to valorize the Shudra political economy or culture or philosophy as he tends to read it. Ilaya frequently cites Jyotirao Phule and B.R. Ambedkar as being crucial to the development of a Shudra critique. He also refers to Periyar as an important Dalit Bahujan thinkers. And as I told you, it was Periyar in Tamil Nadu who made the Shudra critique popular and acceptable in the public sphere, cementing what is commonly known now as Dravidian politics. See, as a sociological and a political category, the term Shudra can be extremely confusing, right? So, because, for instance, the Yadavs would technically come under the Shudra category, just as intermediate castes like Devars or Gaundars in the southern state of Tamil Nadu would also. But then there is very little cultural or sort of political commonalities between these communities, but for the fact that they are assumed to be Shudras in their respective regions. In a commonsensical understanding, Shudras are equated with the administrative category of other backward classes. But again, this is also misleading because there are also forward caste communities like the Basus of Bengal, Subhash Chandra Bose and so on. And likewise, the Saiva Vellala Pillais of Tamil Nadu, who are also technically Shudras, but who come under the general category. However, it is taken, it is argued by academics like Jaffalo that OBCs form the bulk of the Shudras and represent about half of the Indian population, if not more. Now, it is worth remembering that the administrative category of OBC was created after consideration of several socio-economic factors of backwardness. However, we must note that they are called class, other backward classes, while the scheduled caste category has a clear mention of caste. And it covers the castes that have historically suffered and continue to suffer different forms of untouchability. The concreteness around the scheduled caste category facilitated the emergence of a pan-Indian Dalit identity and intellectual conversations, even if Dalit politics has actually been localized in practice. And it also, of course, has its own internal tensions in each region, but that's the subject of a separate debate. But we can see that the vagueness and ambiguities around the Shudra OBC intermediate caste question results in not only their politics being localized, but also in the absence of pan-Indian intellectual debates on this identity or identities. So this probably is one important reason why a leader like Lalu Prasad Yadav or Mulayam Singh Yadav or Karunanidhi were largely confined to their own respective regions, and they were largely regional leaders than being seen as pan-Indian leaders, even though they represented or came from OBC communities. Whereas on the other hand, Mayawati, who is largely centered or galvanizes around the Jatav politics of Uttar Pradesh, is seen by many Dalit intellectuals as a sort of a pan-Indian Dalit leader, right? Anyway, so Yogendra Yadav argues that there is a reluctance to conduct a caste census, as it may reveal that the actual large numbers of the OBCs, and also that their plight is worse off than the top layer of the scheduled caste communities. Now, this also reflects on the paucity of debates in the intelligentsia is the minimal representation of OBC academics in central universities in India, which is worse than the representation of academics from the scheduled caste communities. In Tamil Nadu, however, the situation for the OBCs has been much better, to which the Dravidian parties can take considerable credit. In the recent work titled The Dravidian Model, authored by Kalayarasan and Vijay Bhaskar, the authors explain that the populist policies pursued by the Dravidian parties that have been in power in the state brought about an inclusive model of development that led to significant socioeconomic mobilities of the OBCs and the scheduled castes. Now, this was not the mobilities of particular dominant communities of the OBCs alone, but also OBC communities which were unable to galvanize themselves politically in large numbers. So the authors argue that it was the Periyar's politics of self-respect and equality, which Anastasia, we could probably discuss over, which played a crucial role in shaping the unique politics of the state. Now, I understand that it was Periyar's substantial understanding of casteism and the position of the Shudra communities and the relation to the scheduled caste communities, which enabled him to develop a nuanced perspective that was well aware of local realities and the several internal contradictions between castes, while not losing sight of the critique of the Brahmanism as a system. A mechanistic understanding of casteism looks at Dalits as the only victims of casteism, oppressed by all those above them, where physical violence and explicit acts of discrimination are the only criteria to categorize victim identities. On the other hand, a substantial understanding of casteism, which I claim Periyar had, looks at Dalits as the most oppressed by casteism, but not the only oppressed of casteism, and understands the degraded social, political, and economic status of both the Dalits and the intermediate caste to be an interlinked problem. So from the start of the self-respect movement in 1925, Periyar uses the term non-Brahmin to refer to not just who were not Brahmins, but more specifically to those who, according to him, were oppressed or degraded by the Brahmins and the Brahminical system. To Periyar, several communities divided as castes, the untouchable and the unseeable caste, Christians, Muslims, and Anglo-Indians were also non-Brahmins. Used loosely, non-Brahmin may make no political sense, as a Brazilian, Ugandan, Japanese, or German are all technically non-Brahmins. But the specific usage in Tamil Nadu that was popularized after the publication of the Non-Brahmin Manifesto in 1917 made this term have concrete political value in that it signaled an opposition to Brahmin hegemony and to dominant nationalist imaginations. However, unlike many of his contemporaries in the Justice Party, Periyar openly acknowledged the divisions within the non-Brahmin communities, and he did not try to use the non-Brahmin identity as an easy suturing of conflicts. Likewise, while considering the Dalits as a crucial part of the non-Brahmin identity, he was alert to their specific interests and also argued that they needed proportional representation much more than the other non-Brahmin castes. To Periyar, the Dalits were closer to the idea of self-respect and equality since they were out of the Varna order. He saw them as being naturally inclined to self-respect thinking. Periyar was clear that the Shudras had to fight alongside the scheduled caste and the untouchable caste as such, if at all they could free themselves from the ignominy of caste system. To counter caste, preaching alone would not be enough. Social revolution and progressive laws were also necessary. Periyar says that as long as untouchability existed against the Adi Dravidas and the other scheduled caste communities, the Dravidians would continue to face discrimination from the Aryans. Taking a leaf from Aristotle's book, Periyar says that man is a social animal, but the Hindu religion divides society and legitimates social hierarchies. He accused the Brahmin nationalists of sloganeering down with imperialism while continuing to discriminate against the Shudras and maintaining caste distinctions. While the divisions in North India were on religious lines of Hindu and Muslim, in South India, the divisions between Brahmin and Shudra were crucial, according to Periyar. Responding to Savarkar's claim that the Muslims were to be opposed because of their aggression, Periyar argues that if that were the case, then there was more reason to oppose the Hindus because of their aggression towards and the inferiorization of the Shudras and the untouchable castes. Periyar, however, for all his emphasis on proportional representation, did not believe that mere representation of non-Brahmins in places of power would end their social degradation. Referring to the powerful positions held by non-Brahmin notables, he remarks that despite the positions, they could do little for the improvement of the majority of the society, nor could they remove the ignominy of Sudrahood in society. He accuses these Shudras in power of being unable to confront Brahmanism and for the subscription of Brahminical culture and practices. So it is this consistent critique of power which Periyar places, whether it be of Brahmins, whether it be of Shudras, or even scheduled castes who attain political power. It is this consistent critique of power, which compels me to place him in this anarchist libertarian tradition. Right? So he criticizes the Tamils who attain a position of power for looking down on those below them as lower caste, for imitating the Brahmins, and for treating the poor as Shudras. So he overlaps a sort of a caste and class analysis over here. More specifically, he says that his Dravidian movement will fight against whoever oppresses the untouchable caste. Periyar adds that irrespective of whether the untouchable caste join his party or not, they have the rights to claim the benefits of his party's efforts. Such explicit overtures by Periyar towards the Dalits contradicts the claims by academics like Narendra Subramaniam that Periyar's conception of the Dravidian has at its center the Tamil-speaking Shudra, while the Dalits are pushed to an outer layer. As I have argued in my previous works, while fighting for the political rights of the non-Brahmin community as a whole, Periyar was attentive to and vocally stood by the specific struggles of the Dalits, even if it offended the intermediate caste, who comprise the overwhelming majority in Tamil. Periyar believed that not only the Brahmins, but also the intermediate caste behaved in a foul and perhaps even violent manner towards the Dalits and were complicit in their oppression. Addressing the non-Brahmin people who think of themselves as upper caste, he said that they wouldn't be able to get rid of their own inferiority unless and until they worked with the untouchable caste to help the latter get rid of theirs. How much more time do I have?
I think if you can wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes, we will.
Lovely, lovely. I'll wrap up. Yeah. So see to Periyar, even the elite non-Brahmin communities like the Mudaliyars, Chettiars, or Nayakars were Shudras. Periyar says that these communities adopted high-sounding names like Mudaliyar or Nayakar only to hide their Shudra status. Now, this might appear as a sort of a blind spot in Periyar's perspective because he was mapping powerful and elite non-Brahmin communities like the Mudaliyars with the subaltern intermediate castes like the Vanniyars, Vannars and Nadars and Devars as Shudras. This probably would be the equivalent of comparing just mapping Jats and Kurmis as Shudras and assuming that they have common political interests. But I don't think Periyar is doing that, because his point was that despite their powerful positions, these elite communities were ritually Shudras, and worse, they did nothing to challenge their ritual status as well as that of the other communities that were lower to them. He criticizes the elite Velalar communities for considering themselves as Sat Shudras, that is the clean Shudras, and for placing themselves above the intermediate castes such as the Maravas, Kallas, and others, noting that this only strengthens the superior position of the Brahmins. He criticizes the elite non-Brahmin communities for consenting to be Shudras and for not adopting egalitarian politics. He says, and I quote him, instead of getting in power or betraying our ideals and falling at the feet of our enemies for the sake of power, we should stand on the side of the common people and apply pressure on those in power. Power within the ambit of the nation state to Periyar not only corrupted the Shudra, but also Brahmanized them. The bracketing, so as a counter, what Periyar imagines is the identity of the Dravidian, which was meant to be an identity of dignity, equality, and self-respect for the people of South India and to anyone who was derogatorily referred to as Shudras and Panchamas, even if they were beyond the borders of South India. The bracketing of society into castes, where each imagined and desired superiority over the other, had made it impossible for Tamils or Indians to consider themselves a nation. If at all Indians were to be a nation, they had to reject such ritual hierarchies and build a community on the premise of egalitarianism. It is in this light that Periyar's so-called separatist statements have to be seen. It was not because a separate Dravida Nadu was a desirable end in itself. The Dravida Nadu slogan, or the slogan for a separate Dravida Nadu, was not placed as a program for political action, but only, in my reading, as a criticism of the dominant nationalist imagination and what it attempted to conceal, namely the problem of caste. In a sense, Periyar was alluding to the impossibility of a nation as long as caste persisted. In his recent work, Mahmood Mamdani argues that, and I quote Mamdani, decolonizing the political is nothing less than the reimagining the order of the nation state. Mamdani further recommends a critical approach to the taken for granted nationalist imagination. Periyar's de-Brahminical approach offers one possibility of thinking beyond the mainstream misconceptions of the nation and reimagining an inclusive Indian polity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karthik. Thank you. So I'll just a quick remark, and then perhaps Indrajit can reply, and Karthik as well, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So again, my words of caution about as we think about assertions of agency, assertions of respectability, recognition, insistence on life getting better, on insistence on having a place in society and politics that is not a terrible place. We need to again be very careful about sort of in smuggling in the categories of liberal analysis, which we all, academics, we all are, very deep inside of. So it's natural that whenever we hear dignity, we think equality. Whenever we hear rights, we think equality. Whenever we hear anything good, we sort of assume that people who are asking for these social and political goods are also asking for equality and also are assuming equality. So just a word of caution. What I heard again, you saying, Karthik, about Periyar's philosophy was that it was anti-Brahminical. And indeed, just as in Lalu's case, Brahminism has been the focus of a lot of caste political assertion. And of course, we do know that Brahmins were drastically elevated during the British rule. I mean, that's probably the biggest overall sort of social intrusion, I think, of the British, that they raised Brahmins who, what records we have from the 18th century and going backwards, is that they didn't actually play a particularly special role in Indian society or politics, apart from inside their own scriptures. At the courts of local kings, bards were much more significant, but they were removed, and with the disenfranchisement of India's political leaders. So you have this community of a post-colonial community class that has been elevated to the status of social, saints, which have, been sort of employees and pensioners of the Raj, and many of them, have become the educated elite, and that colonial situation has continued into the post-colony, where the Brahmins, they are on TV, they overwhelmingly, are in the press, on TV, in universities, and so on, right? So there is a huge amount of this anti-Brahminism and anti-Brahminical logic of purity and pollution, because you don't actually neither do you get in historical accounts, nor in ethnographic observation do you get much talk of purity and pollution among, in ordinary sort of unpoliticized everyday social life. Caste is a funny word to use for the logic of jatis. I mean, and that logic is simply about each community, which is a sort of imagined as a big family, having a particular occupational role, social role, but indeed political role, which has been taken up in the democratic context, and also ritual role, which doesn't necessarily cohere with the logic of purity and pollution at all. But the logic of purity and pollution is the Brahminical claim to their superiority, and that is what I'm hearing you.
Oh, I think Anastasia froze. Let's see. Give me a minute. In the meantime, if any of you have questions, can you type them in the chat box or the Q&A box, or raise your hands? And if you're raising your hands, please keep it brief, if I may request you.
Can I
Karthik.
have a few things for Indrajit.
Okay, go for it.
So Indrajit, these are just questions of a lay external observer. So just we need some clarifications of this. See, I just wanted to know what is Lallu Prasad's influence or reception among non-Yadav OBC communities, right? Do they also equally perceive him as a leader, or has he been able to manage to build this sort of cross-caste alliances among the different OBC communities of Bihar? Secondly, is the extent of his affiliation with Ram Manohar Lohia's ideology, right? So do you think there are certain points where he actually deviates with the Lohia's proposal for a sort of an indigenous or an Indian form of socialism? And finally, just wanted to know the sort of what are the possible differences or disjuncts between his politics and that of Mulayam Singh Yadav's?
I think Anastasia is connecting to audio. So Indrajit, if you can just respond to Karthik's question, and then.
Okay, I'll respond then to Karthik's question, and then once Anastasia can join us, that'll be useful. I think you're right, Karthik, in picking up the relatively limited appeal, electoral appeal, that Lalu enjoys among the non-Yadav OBC communities. But that is now. I think certainly during his 15 years in power, that would not have been possible. The sorts of majorities that he won, it would not have been possible without, transcending the, support from his own Yadav community. But you're absolutely right. Much of the appeal was limited to the Yadavs, and of course, overwhelming support from the Muslims. And I think the ability to transcend the Hindu-Muslim divide and to actually draw in the Yadavs into this alliance with the Muslims is quite spectacular. Actually, it is quite incomparable, given that in rural North India historically it was considered, members of the Yadav community were the ones who were usually the forefront of Hindu-Muslim violence, and to break that and to involve both Yadavs and Muslims in a sort of a political coalition. And let's be clear, it was a political coalition. It was not a social coalition. You didn't have intermarriage and inter sort of commensality. No. But it was a political coalition where, and I think this is where the departure from liberal ideas is important. They were not, it wasn't that everyone was a free and equal individual. I mean, the joke in Bihar was the Muslims have all the security, the Yadavs have all the contracts. So, there's that. But remember, beyond that piece of humor, the fact that, you had a beleaguered minority that was being defended by a very, very important part of the majority that had historically been used, against them, or had, if you look at the agency of groups, they were at the forefront of the violence themselves. So I think the ability to transcend the Yadav support and, gather support from other communities is important and not something we should ignore. I think the departures from Lohiya's ideology some of them were very obvious. I mean, Lohia was much more supportive of redistribution of resources, but at the end of the day, I think from what Yadav really took from Lohia was the importance of caste as a central element of Indian society rather than class. So in a sense, it's socialism appropriated to Indian conditions where you don't speak the language of abstract class, but you recognize that caste and caste alone is the basis on which resources are distributed across the board. I think a key disjuncture with Lohiya's work was the language question. And whereas Lohia was very keen that Hindi is some sort of a national language across India, which miraculously non-Hindi speakers will sort of adopt, Lalu was very clear and very realistic about it. Also, remember, he was a politician of the 1990s. Coalition politics in Delhi were quite key, and his relations with the Karunanidhis, the Deve Gaudas, alerted him to the impossibility of imposing English anywhere, leave alone in Bihar. And I think you asked about the difference between him and Mulayam Singh, and one key difference was the language question. Although education remained, quite sort of, it wasn't much to speak of in either UP or Bihar, but Lalu was very clear that there was no question of imposing Hindi or having only Hindi, and that English was a route that people should take to educate themselves, get out of the state if necessary, get out of the country if necessary. Whereas Mulayam Singh was much more inward looking in terms of, it was almost bordering a Hindi sort of fanatic in that was the only sort of language. I think in that sense, Lalu was much more a realist in the sense that you realize the political coalitions you have to build. And you recognize that it is not only practical, but also perhaps not desirable that the entire country speaks one language. And I think in that sense, it was a departure from both Lohia and Mulayam Singh. I think that would be my preliminary sort of response to your question. But thanks for asking that.
Anastasia, over to you.
Yes, my apologies. My internet at home is dysfunctioning, so I'm back on my phone. Let's hope that works. Yes, and what about Kartik? Because has Kartik responded to?
No, it was a question that
Kartik
had for Indrajit, but they're yet to respond on all your comments. So it's just a filler in between. You've not missed anything per se.
Okay. Okay, good. So maybe Indrajit and Kartik can comment as much or as little as they like on things that I have said, and then we can open up for discussion. And I've got a question now waiting that I will read out to Kartik.
Great. So Anastasia, if I could respond to your very keen comments, I think I'm really glad you picked this up, the almost absence of equality, so to speak, in a lot of the speeches I quoted. And I think here it's really useful to think about Lalu not so much as a theorist, but as a practitioner. Or obviously he was a politician, and I think we have to be very careful that Lalu is no revolutionary. He's not even a social reformer. Let's be very clear about it. What matters, I think, sorry, I missed that.
He's no leveler, who are also practitioners.
Yes. However, that said, on the leveler question, I think that's where things get really interesting. What is central as far as Lalu is concerned? What is central is power. And I think that's where the question of equality comes in. The idea that power has so far been in the hands of certain groups who have gained and cornered power. And you've very correctly pointed out the logic of colonialism, which elevated the Brahmins to the sort of position that they may not in practice have had before. What I think Lalu's sort of thinking about, and his practice gets us to really think about how everyone ought to have an equal shot at power. And what does that mean? How does that link with equal moral worth? The whole idea, when you think about, you count the uncounted, we don't even have an account of the numbers. And I think Karthik mentioned this, there are differences in understandings of whether the Shudras or backward castes or low castes, whatever you call them, we just don't know what numbers they are. We don't know whether they are 40% of your population or 60% of the population or 80%. We just don't know. We simply don't know. Now, that is an unthinkable situation in any other country where a certain sort of, marker of discrimination, whether real or imagined, plays such a big role. I mean, think about England, for instance, and I think it's good that you mentioned the colonial roots of the Brahmanical elevation. A country like England, there's no question of not having race as a marker. Now, of course, France and Germany have their own complications with racial logics. But I think the question of
it would be equally difficult to have a head count of classes in Britain, because it would be very, who makes up the working class? It's just as uncountable as it is in.
But I do think that the question of counting the uncounted is where you're thinking about a logic of equality, where at least everyone has an equal right to be counted. We know from surveys that have been done that whatever be the sort of historicity of caste distinctions or not, inter-caste marriages are just a tiny proportion of marriages. I think less than 5% of Indians marry across caste. This was a survey in the Times of India. So caste is a reality, and it is a reality which means that you must count those who have been uncounted. Now, of course, the Indian state does count the number of scheduled castes and scheduled tribe communities, as you know. But we simply don't have a count of the so-called lower castes, etc. And I think the demand for a caste census that has been quite central to Lalu Yadav's politics is one way to really think about equal moral worth, the equality of being counted, as it were. I think the second point is the question about cultural value. You have, if you can celebrate certain festivals, why can't you celebrate others? And I think this is not so much of an anti-Brahmanism. I don't think he was calling for not celebrating the Ram Navamis and the Diwalis and the Dasharas, but also celebrating and observing the Ravidas Jayantis, the Chuharmal fairs, the fairs associated with different communities. Now, you said, and you're quite right, I think, Anastasia, in getting us to think of this more as an assertion of voice, as a recognition of voice. And although the language of equality is not deployed explicitly, I think there is a move towards recognizing not liberal equality. And I think I think we can agree on this. It's not liberal equality of every individual, but it's equality of different groups. And I think that's sort of key, in a way that you might think about the United Nations as an equality of different nations, where it becomes absolutely indefensible for one nation to have superior or majoritarian or supremacist sort of attitudes towards another. It's the same sort of equality between groups that I think this sort of politics gets us to think. And then the question of affirmative action. Of course, the basis of affirmative action is caste distinctions, the existing caste distinctions. And I don't think either Lalu or any of the other socialist sort of politicians or regional politicians believe that caste will magically just wither away. They're not even talking about annihilating caste in the sense of Ambedkar, because they realize that A, it's not good politics, B, it's probably not good society. Sorry?
Mm-hmm. If caste went away, they'd go away with it. They would vanish as political entities.
Well,
and their entire party.
I'm sure they can reinvent themselves. They're quite canny politicians, you know. So let's not deny them that agency. But what matters is that caste as a reality exists. And because caste as a reality exists and caste as a tool of social oppression exists, you pointed out the ways in which, you know, certain groups dominate the media, the universities, the academia, etc. That dominance has to go, is the argument here. And therefore, it's, again, not liberal equality. And I think we should be very clear that there are many routes to equality, and liberalism is only one among several routes to equality. You know, Lalu wasn't reading Kant and couldn't be bothered about, you know, what Kant might have to say about equality or dignity. But what he was taking very seriously was Ravidas, was Kabir, was Juharmal, who have their own quite endogenous arguments towards equality, which of course recognize the equality of different groups and recognize that it's, you know, through actions like affirmative action policies that you might have, you know, some attempt at a sort of social equality between groups. Now, I'd like to reiterate again that we have to think about Lalu as a politician, of course. And so what matters really is how you make power, how you make sure that everyone has an equal shot at getting power. He's no revolutionary, he's no reformer, but what he is interested is to revise the terms on which people gain access to power. And there's a great deal of caste pride involved, of course, you know, as you very correctly said, and Lucia Micheliuti's work points out to the way in which Yadavs in Uttar Pradesh sort of appropriate the legends of Krishna. But I think that's what also makes, paradoxically, the Yadav leaders, all the more hated within the Hindus, because they're really considered religion traitors. You know, they are using Hinduism and they are using Hindu myths in ways that subvert the social order from within, rather than, you know, converting to other religions or saying that other religions are somehow better. What they're saying is that there are adequate ways in which you can subvert Hinduism, the Hindu social order from within, and assert a sort of equality of different castes. And I think that really leads to the final point, and I'd like to conclude on this because it links up to a definitional, sort of a conceptual point that Karthik, you made as well. You know, the logic of democracy means you have to win elections, you have to create majorities. Now, there is a tempting majority in India, which is the Hindu-Muslim sort of binary, the Hindu majority, the Muslim minority. But I think what Lalu is interested in is really to rearrange that majority into what he famously in Bihar calls the cleavage between the backwards and the forwards, where the backwards, in a sense, you know, relate to the category of Bahujan, though he doesn't use the term Bahujan. But the backwards are not only the OBCs, but also the scheduled caste groups. And the forwards are not just the Brahmins, but all the other Savarna groups. And Lalu has this quite interesting term to describe them. He calls them Bhurabal in the 1990s. And Bhurabal is a very interesting term because it is at once an acronym. And in that sense, Lalu is an acronym maker before the supreme leader who rules today. So Bhurabal is an acronym for the Bhumihar, Rajput, Brahman, and Lala. So, you know, it's Bhurabal, but Bhurabal also translates into blonde. So in a sense, it makes them the other, the foreigner. He doesn't use those terms, of course, but, you know, the outsider, as it were, and refers to, I think it's the dust that gathers around the grain and which you must get rid of, you know. So he says, Bhurabal hatao Bihar bachao, as in remove the Bhurabal, and not, of course, he's very clear, not liquidate them, but remove them from positions of power and reorient the majority towards the backwards. And this backward-forward split actually remains part of Bihar's political narrative even now, And Karthik, you asked about the relevance of Lalu's and the appeal of Lalu's politics beyond the Yadavs. So even though the non-Yadav OBCs no longer vote for Yadav, they very much take seriously this backward-forward split in Bihar, which is an attempt to reorient the majority, because majorities are important, as you say, Anastasia. Majorities are important in democracies. You reorient it towards a backward-forward sort of split, where the backwards are the majority and ought to rule, rather than a Hindu majority that has a divine right to rule. I'll stop there because I think I've gone on far too much, but I hope I responded to some of your very, very keen and thoughtful questions, Anastasia.
Thank you, Indrajit. I am wondering, lest we lose the crowd, there are a couple of questions that are waiting. Why don't I read them out, and Karthik can reply to my comments should you wish to, as well as the questions that people are asking. Okay, so one is a question for Karthik. Which says the following: Tamil Nadu has seen a century of anti-caste politics and has been considerably successful. However, one of the questions constantly posed is, there is so much anti-Dalit violence in Tamil Nadu. What do you think has changed and hasn't changed? And then there's another attendee who's asking the following. And that's to both of the speakers. There's a lot of antagonism between Ambedkar on the one side and the other social reformers like Lokia, Periyar, Phule, and others. The antagonism is relayed by some Dalits and Ambedkar on the other hand as increasingly championed by the BJP. This is happening in spite of a famous troika photo of Ambedkar, Marx as Periyar doing the rounds, etc. What do you think are the ramifications? Good question. So why don't you, Karthik, comment on the questions that I've just posed, and perhaps anything that I've said.
Yeah, thank you, Anastasia. So let me start off by responding to a very important point which you raised regarding the foregrounding of the critique of Brahmanism, right? See, I mean, obviously one was a very contemporary pressure which was put on these anti-caste thinkers like be it Phule or Ambedkar or Periyar, was that some of the dominant figures of Indian nationalism or the mainstream figures in the Indian nationalist narrative consistently valorized the Brahminical and the Brahmin communities, whether it be political leaders like Lokmanya Tilak or Annie Besant or H.S. Olcott or Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whoever these people be, whether they be political radicals or social reformers or religious reformers, they had a tendency to project the Brahminical, the Brahmin, and overlap it with the national and the nationalist ideal. This definitely was a product of the colonial times and perhaps even a response to the colonial times. But then again, it also generated the counter or the anti-Brahminical response from the representatives of what we call the subaltern sections. But is this grounded only in colonial history and not in pre-colonial history? I mean, I can at least speak from the perspective of Tamil Nadu or the history of Tamil Nadu, that there were attempts to challenge mainstream or dominant forms of religion by other sort of esoteric forms of faiths, even in the pre-colonial times, right? For instance, the Siddhars, for instance, were a sort of a wandering form of ascetics who constantly opposed and criticized what we would call as the the rituals of Saivism or Vaishnavism, which were associated with temples and land power in the state, right? And likewise, the other source of intellectual material, which came very much to the foreground during the colonial times, were the Shrutis, the Smritis, and the Puranas, right? Now, whether it be the Shrutis of the Vedas or the Smritis, the Manusmriti or whatever, or even the more, diverse or pluralistic Puranas, right? Whether it be the Shiva Purana or the Bhagavata Purana or the Skanda Purana or whatever, all of them tended to generally claim in the course of their narratives that At the end of the day, the Brahmin was the god on earth, right? So when this sort of a narrative was being projected as the national and as well as the normal, I think it was quite incumbent on anti-caste reformers, or people who are trying to discuss or reimagine social egalitarianism, to critically look at the ideal which was being proposed by these texts and by the upholders of these texts and narratives. So that's my sort of brief response to it. But yeah, this really is something to deliberate much over. Okay, so in response to that question on the successfulness of anti-caste politics, I think as far as an anti-caste politics or philosophy as an aim or an end goal or whatever, I don't think we should be using the binaries of success or failure to measure it, right? Because I don't think it's like a cricket match where we can say this team has won and that team has lost. This is going to be a very protracted and prolonged process, and we really cannot have very clear criteria for successes and failures. But at least as far as Tamil Nadu is concerned, we could probably rely on socio-economic indicators of specific communities and how they have progressed over the period of time. If we could take the Indian independence as a benchmark and then move forward and see how different communities, how they fared at 1947, how they fared in 1967 when the DMK, the Dravidian parties came into power, and how they have fared 50 years later. I think that would be a sort of a very clear sort of a benchmark on the possible impact of these sort of anti-caste ideas on Tamil Nadu's society. Regarding violence as such, see, it's not only, I mean, definitely there are many severe and serious cases of violence in against the Dalits in Tamil Nadu. But it's also there very much in Kerala as well, which has been hailed as a communist and progressive state, as well as the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. But I don't think this should be seen as a sort of a consequence of the Dravidian movement, but rather a sort of a limitation of several progressive movements that captured state power, to use the state power in a manner that they could mitigate, if not at least stop, caste violence, right? And this is precisely the reason why Periyar was very critical of state power, because he very strongly believed that state power was not enough to stop casteism or caste violence, and that you needed to constantly have a program of social education and social pressure to reshape the caste mentality among the Tamil or the Indian population. Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you make a comment if you'd like on the questions that were asked, but I think we are almost alone now. There are two brave people who have remained, and we should be wrapping up, shouldn't we, Vignesh? We've got an hour and a half, is that right? Yeah, we're a few minutes after, but we did start a bit late. So
can I just respond to that one question that's been addressed? I think you're right that there can be lots of distinctions that could be drawn between Ambedkar and Periyar and Phule, and that's understandable. They were all very different, operating in very different milieus. Obviously, just because they're all speakers or proponents of equality doesn't necessarily mean they will all say the same things. But I think really the key question is to think about what, the sorts of things that, you can draw from them and how you might respond to the present situation, which I think the first question sort of puts it, the sort of social bloc that might be a way out of the present predicament. And I think some sort of, what sort of Periyar would have, the way Periyar would have it, the way even Ambedkar would have it, by the way. Remember the clause for affirmative action for social and I think what they call socio-economic backward castes or whatever was put into the directive principles of state policy thanks to Ambedkar's interventions. In turn, remember that the Bharat Ratna was conferred on Ambedkar by VP Singh's government, which was essentially sort of pushed by the parties that supported the Mandal Commission recommendation. So the point is that there's much more in common between these different groups, and I think working on those commonalities is important. An alliance, a backward alliance or a Bahujan alliance or a alliance between OBCs and scheduled castes is perhaps the only way forward. It is true, as the first questioner puts, that there's a lot of ridicule that is faced by the lower castes by different groups. But I'm afraid as the numerical majority, the onus is really on the lower caste to lead this and to assuage any worries that they will sort of take over the top and replicate the caste hierarchies against which they are all fighting. That onus lies with the OBC politicians. And they are really have, I think you have to think about India today at the cusp of a power transition. And if you think about that transition to power, you think about who's, the groups that are waiting in the wings, so to speak, taking over power. Anastasia has already talked about how anti-Brahmin movements have been relatively sort of, successful in pushing the top groups out of political power. But it's the groups that are waiting in the wings that have to assure everyone that they are not going to reproduce the dominance, reproduce the hierarchies, but really work towards an egalitarian political order. I'll stop there on that idealistic, optimistic note.
Great. Thank you, Indrajit, and thank you, Karthik and Vignesh, for organizing this, and fantastic discussion. And thank you to our audience, who have stuck with us to the end. Thank you again. And this conversation.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, for doing this. And thank you, Indrajit and Karthik, for actually being here. The discussion will be put up online on YouTube. And thank you very much once again.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Had a great time.
Yes.
Yeah, cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.